So today I want to present you or clarify a bit the debate about the idea of a European universal basic income, or as it was called by Philippe Van Parijs, a Euro dividend. Basically, the context in which from which I started this research was first that there was a lot of discussions on the idea of a universal basic income focused on its justification and on its design at national level. And on the other hand, you had interesting debates about how the EU could itself be involved in social protection. And the proposals were mostly related to the idea of a European minimum income, so a conditional minimum income, a European unemployment scheme. And even these different proposals took a new where they are living a new momentum now with the COVID response. And now we have a new context with the pandemic and its social effects, because many have advocated the introduction of an emergency UBI, and there was even a petition calling for the EU to introduce a UBI for all Europeans, regardless of the competences that are distributed between national member states and the EU. We have now the European Citizens Initiative calling the EU for support in 2 member states in order to introduce a UBI at national level. And so I think it is interesting to open up the debate about how the EU could itself be an actor in this basic income debate by distributing a UBI on its own. So the presentation I will do will be focused in 3 main points. The first one, what is the European Universal Basic Income or Euro dividend about? Why, if at all, is it desirable? And then I will focus on the various issues of feasibility. So first of all, it is a basic income, so with the same characteristics as a national one, individual, universal, and unconditional. But the main difference here is that when we say that a basic income is distributed to all the members of a political community, here the political community englobes the whole of the EU, and I would specify even further EU residents. It is also a partial cash payment, so a partial UBI, because it is not enough on its own to live on. I will explain why it is seen as a partial cash payment. And the discussions generally speak of a UBI that is about between 200 and 300 euros in average. When we say in average, it's so per person and per month. And when I say in average, it's because it would be different according to the cost of living in each country. And for the purpose of this presentation, I will focus on the proposal that was made by Philippe of about 200 euros per person per month in average. So first, why should we specifically look at the EU level? Well, we could argue that as long as national social security systems are improved, whether through the introduction of a basic income or whether in the making current minimum income or other social benefits more accessible, more universal, less conditional, and so on, and with higher levels as well, we would be well enough, and we wouldn't need the EU. But we also know that EU integration has had a destructuring impact on national social protection arrangements, and that there was no sufficient restructuring at the supranational level. We all know the constraints of European integration on national capacities for redistribution and stabilization. When we talk about competition between regulatory systems, fiscal and social dumping, the rules of budgetary discipline, even if we see some changes now. Of course, the lack of, well, the incompleteness of the European Monetary Union, and so on and so forth. We also know that there's a political difficulty to have some form of social Europe, social harmonization, given the diversity of welfare regimes, their underpinning philosophy, the variation in terms of economic performance between member states, the social imbalances between them, and so on. And so the UBI may be also a mechanism that could be seen here as one way to overcome some of the barriers to social harmonization. and provide potentially a new impetus for a social Europe that would need more legitimacy on the social side. So to clarify how this should be conceived of, we could think of the EU as a multi-layered social Europe, and the EUBI would be part of that conception of a social Europe between different layers. The national, which itself can be divided between the regional and the local levels, if this is the way social security is organized, and then the European layer, which would basically come as a supplement, complement the national welfare regimes. So we are not talking about a supranational welfare state. We are not necessarily talking about the introduction of a national UBI and a European UBI. The European one could exist in the current context without necessarily introducing one at the national level. And the idea should be to have, at the very least, a social minimum guaranteed to all Europeans. So, at least in my perspectives, there are two main dimensions: the need for minimum standards, for example, the adequacy of minimum income, a sufficiently high level, minimum wage, etc. So, which should be guaranteed by law. And a direct involvement, this is a second aspect, a direct involvement of the EU in social matters. And here we are talking of, for example, a minimum income fund it's the kind of stuff that is discussed when we talk about the implementation of adequate and accessible minimum income at EU level, that it should have a fund at EU level to help the different member states raise their own level and improve their own social schemes to reach European standards. It's the same when we talk about a European unemployment insurance scheme. The EU could come as an actor complementing what is existing at national level. And so here we would have this direct involvement of the EU in the form of a European basic income. I think we should see the potential benefits of this European basic income in terms of three levels of support. The first one is an individual one. The EUBI could act as part of an anti-poverty strategy. The second one is a member state level, where the EUBI, so European Universal Basic Income, I will say EUBI to go faster, could be an instrument to support national welfare state capacities. And the third level of support is EU level, and how the EUBI could potentially act as an instrument of legitimacy. These are, in different ways, some of the arguments that have been made by Philippe Van Parijs. So I should give back to Cesar what is owed to Cesar, but I have sometimes some nuances compared to some of his claims. So first, let's see how the UBI could support individuals. So here we know the problems in terms of poverty at EU level, and even if in 2010 the EU had a poverty target that was quite ambitious to reduce the number of Europeans living at risk of poverty by 2020, this target was clearly not met. It was said this morning as well, and here we could see how potentially the European basic income could be a complementary approach to what exists at national level. If we first take the question of minimum income schemes, for example, if the idea here would be that the UBI would complement what exists at national level. So if you have a guaranteed minimum income, conditional one at national level, and then on top of that, the European basic income, the aim should be to reach at least a sufficiency level. If we take the example of Philippe's euro dividend of about 200 euros in average, this would mean that we would have about 85 euros for an individual in Bulgaria, and about 273 euros for one in Denmark. If you add that to the local minimum income, in some cases you reach a sufficiency level, in others you don't. If we take the example of Belgium, for example, you would reach you would be 100 euros underneath the poverty threshold. So we are going towards the social minimum, but this level is still not enough. But it would improve clearly the situation of individuals, and clearly those in the southern and eastern member states in particular. The EUBI would also avoid some of the problems that you have with conditional minimum income schemes, because it would not be well, in terms of coverage, because it would not be means tested and not associated with any other forms of conditionality, no distinction between deserving and undeserving poor. And so in terms of coverage, it would easily be, well, avoid some of the problems of traditional minimum income schemes. But it would still need additional measures. And I was talking of minimum standards. If we want to avoid that member states, for example, reduce the amount of existing social benefits by the amount of the European basic income. If we want this to be something that is improving the situation, then we need to avoid the member states having, well, suppressing the equivalent in existing social benefits. For those who are on employment, it could have an effect by providing supplementary purchasing power, and therefore well, help those in low wage or in work poverty conditions. And it would certainly, even if modestly, reduce the strains of chronic uncertainty for those who are in precarious forms of employment. But again, as I mentioned earlier, this is the active direct involvement part, but we should not see this as an alternative to minimum standards, and there should be also work on the side of member states. The aim, therefore, is to have national member states and EU level aiming towards sufficiency altogether. The second level of support is about supporting welfare states' capacities, national welfare states' capacities. And the main argument that is advanced in general here is that the UBI would, or the euro dividend would have, would work as a macroeconomic stabilizer. So it would be one way to organize risk sharing, and in particular in the monetary union, which needs a fiscal capacity, by playing the role of automatic stabilizer and basically offer one way to absorb social shocks. And support the aggregate demand in times of crisis. Since I want to have a broad scope of everything, I will not go into the detail, but here we have a debate basically between Philippe Van Parijs's argument of a euro dividend funded by a VAT, which could act as a macroeconomic stabilizer, and on the other hand, a response by Frank van den Broek, who argued in one or two papers that a European unemployment scheme would be a better instrument, because it would have, well, it would score better on anti-cyclicality given its internal features. In my view, it is, well, the euro dividend may have a macroeconomic stabilization effect, and it depends clearly on the funding scheme. But it should not be seen as an instrument of stabilization primarily, but more as an instrument of transnational redistribution, one of interpersonal solidarity designed to improve social cohesion, and not simply a cooperative scheme. And so if we take now the third level of support, it would, and this is also an argument made by Philippe, it would act as a source of legitimacy and support the EU project. We are talking here of what the political scientists called output legitimacy, in the sense that we are referring to a concrete material benefit for EU citizens. Well, it would have first a symbolic value, because it would be paid to all Europeans as a recognition of their membership of the EU. It would improve the social citizenship side, and potentially bring it a bit closer to political and economic citizenship. EU political and economic citizenship, even though this social citizenship aspect would not be close to what we have at national level. It would be potentially an embryonic perspective on that matter. But it will also have these concrete advantage of being a regular, visible, tangible material benefit, and that it would also improve individuals' prospects, not only in their home country, but also across national borders. So it would make what some call the aspirational promise of the EU's opportunity structure a bit less unequal, because as you may know, the freedom of movement is, well, let's say workers are more free to move than those who are not workers. You may be aware that if one person from one member state is in another member state and is considered as a burden for the social system, after a period of 3 months, it can be sent back home. So let's say that the freedom of movement is not completely consolidated for everyone. This legitimacy would certainly be improved if we could link the redistribution of wealth generated by European integration with the UBI. And this is, I guess, the main reason why Philippe has called his proposal a Euro dividend, because it would be seen as a dividend on European wealth and distributed to well, you would have a clear link, let's say, between the wealth generated by European integration and its redistribution towards European citizens. And another argument that was made by Yuri Virov is that it would also potentially provide one way to have intergovernmentalists and federalists converge towards one minimally, let's say, minimal conception of social Europe, because for the intergovernmentalist, it would be seen as a minimally disruptive instrument, and for the federalist, maybe an embryonic, let's say, federal welfare state. I think if we take these three main dimensions, the UBI or the Euro dividend is not necessarily the most optimal in each one. There may be more optimal ways to for example, to have macroeconomic stabilization, as I said before, but its strength may be to have its capacity to score well on a broad range of issues altogether. Now, if we go to issues of feasibility, and I will talk about, let's say, three main feasibility aspects: legal feasibility, financial one, and then briefly the administrative one. In terms of legal feasibility, many have argued when we were discussing, for example, when debates were about European minimum income or an employment insurance scheme, that it was actually not feasible because legally, because the treaties would not allow it, because social security is a national competence. But as was said this morning, the EU has a shared competence and can act in support of member states. And there is a clear article on social cohesion that has been used for the introduction of a very mild version of the European unemployment scheme decided in April, which is also used for the justification of a minimum income directive, which was also used for the recovery and resilience, the establishment of the recovery and resilience facility in the recent recovery package. It's the Article 175, paragraph 3 on social cohesion of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. Of course, other paths are also possible if one were to show that this article could not be used. And we know the different paths are enhanced cooperation for a minimum of 9 member states would want to further integration among themselves, an intergovernmental agreement, or even, of course, treaty change. Let's not forget that even if it might be politically difficult at this stage, this remains a possibility. In terms of financial feasibility, we could see 3 main avenues for the funding. And the first one would be the reallocation of existing funds. I do not think this is a promising avenue because most of these funds have other objectives, or they would provide insufficient funds to have a sufficiently viable or meaningful European basic income. The second one would be a rise of national contributions. We know when we see how the different negotiations happened recently and since July with the European budget, the multi-annual financial framework, how this is politically sensitive, how it can be used through blackmail and so on in various ways. And so even if it would be technically a possibility, it seems to be politically difficult. And the last avenue is to connect it with what we call EU own resources. So basically resources that would directly provide what proceeds for the European budget. And you may know that the Parliament and the Parliament and the Council in the recent discussions before Poland and Hungary imposed their veto, had an agreement on some form of constraining calendar for the introduction of a series of own resources. And you may have heard also about the hunger strike of one of the MEPs, Pierre Larouturou, on the whole debate about the financial transaction tax. Here, if we explore the different own resources that are on the table in the current negotiations, or that could be, let's say, in the second package when the political will be there, we could think of the financial transaction tax, a corporate, consolidated tax base, and a European corporate income tax, various forms of environmental taxes, the reform of the emission trading system. These different own resources could provide some basis for the funding of the UBI, but they don't look very promising in terms of the level of the European basic income that we could hope for. If I take only the financial transaction tax, which since Brexit would generate, according to some estimates, about 57 billion a year, and which is altogether more than all the other taxes I mentioned in terms of revenues per year, this would only generate about 10 euros per month per person. If we take the European corporate income tax, with very optimistic assumptions, we would potentially have 100 euros per month. And even these different EU own resources, we may be faced with a trade-off in terms of what they should be used for. Because they are necessary also to finance the Green Deal and to finance the borrowing for the recovery package. The proposal of Philippe, which may be the most feasible, maybe not the most optimal, but the most feasible, is to increase the proportion of EU-wide VAT rate. And this actually has some advantages because it is already part of the European budget. It is the most Europeanized tax. But it is also not the best kind of taxes to redistribute wealth. So that's maybe a little minus on that. Nevertheless, all these different own resources that I mentioned, we are only talking about estimations, and there will have to be a debate about what their best use could be. But we could imagine that, okay, so there are 2 minutes, that the European basic income could, in, I would say, a not so far away future, be part of a recovery package 2.0, but I remain skeptical, and I think there are other steps we need to take, for example, in terms of European minimum income to already improve what exists and potentially have a real European unemployment scheme, which would at least in a temporary way enact the idea of a transfer system at EU level. Maybe to finish quickly, in terms of administrative feasibility, we could think of having a European agency that would direct transfers to EU citizens based on their social security numbers, for example, or have the funds transferred to national agencies as intermediaries. And then last but not least, the question of political feasibility is certainly one where we are the farthest, at least at EU level, because this is a matter of public opinion and strategic coalition building. And the debate on a European-wide basic income remains not very wide, if I can say it like that. And to finish, yes, I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.